Every cloud has a silver lining, or so they say. It can also bring online services and game subscriptions. I guess that does not have the same ring to it though. But with PlayStation rolling out its PlayStation 4 Plus enhanced service across America last week and in Europe later this week, does it offer a silver service? PlayStation added online streaming and subscriptions to its consoles way back in 2014, just after the PlayStation 4 launched. Itself an extension of the PlayStation Network, or PSN, that launched with the PlayStation 3. These have now merged into a single subscription service with 3 tiers on offer, an Essentials, Extra and Premium option. Essentials is predominantly the same as the prior PS Plus, with free monthly games, online cloud gaming, saves and store discounts amongst other benefits. Extra encompasses all these features but adds a curated PS4 and PS5 games catalogue, allowing you to download and play on your local consoles and any of the titles contained therein. This will be updated and rotated over specific periods of time. Premium is the one we'll be looking at in detail today, and it's the previous 2 plus PS1, PS2, PSP and PS3, all available to either download and or play via a stream or a native app on your PS4 Pro or PlayStation 5. You also get time-limited game trials, PS3, PS4 and PS5 streaming, which used to be known as PS Now prior to these merging. And the last 2 areas in streaming and classics are the big growth areas, as they offer something that is still a growing space on the PS4 and PS5 consoles: emulation. The challenge for such an established brand and legacy as Sony's have with the PlayStation is you have a collection of historic games that could be lost to time. With the PlayStation 1 now almost 30 years old, I hope some of you are sitting down, the sheer depth and breadth to pick from is vast. Here Sony have started small and with the PlayStation 5 now offer a complete solution to all prior generations. But they are not all equal. We shall start with the most challenging, the PlayStation 3, and its unique Cell CPU, which remains so an exotic piece of architecture thanks to its mixture of high bandwidth, parallel SPUs, PPUs and split memory from the RSX GPU. It's all outside of the scope for this video, but the short explanation of the challenges faced to emulate this hardware locally is the still relatively powerful and customized hardware gave developers a blank canvas to use and solve problems in a multitude of ways. This means that on a title-by-title basis, the methods deployed are not consistent, may not even be possible to emulate at any playable level, etc., etc. This means that work on a per-title basis is required, and even then, not a guarantee of success. How does this work then? Well, as we talk now at least, the solution PlayStation have taken is to incorporate the PlayStation 3 emulation, in quotes, into their server-based rack solution, aka cloud gaming. And this is the reason that, for now at least, local PlayStation 3 emulation is not possible. As such, these form a good selection of the premium tier, and you simply access the VM client via the local application. You pick your game, wait for the virtual session to initialize remotely, and once active, your PSN account login is passed through and your virtual gaming session starts. That's it. For intents and purposes, a PS3 game running in the cloud. These are genuine Cell and RSX motherboards in a remote data center, thus they are running the genuine PlayStation 3 code remotely, taking your inputs, passing them to the local instance, and then streaming back the output as a normal video and audio stream to your PlayStation 5, PS4 or PC application. As with all solutions here, I'm going to categorize them into 4. The ease and speed of use, the accuracy of emulation solution to the original hardware, the visual issues affected or improvements offered by that, and the performance degradation or improvements if they are present. So taking the PlayStation 3 first and using a later life title in MotorStorm Apocalypse, let's tackle the first category. The game is browsed and selected in the exact same way as any other title across the service. This is the fastest and simplest generation here from that perspective, as no waiting for a download, quick sub 1 minute access to a title, a quick change to another one if required as those VMs are shut down and a new one started. The ease and speed of the solution is excellent, and aside any network issues or such issues in terms of the virtual machine connection, it really could not be any more accessible. Good as it ever was now on PS Now. Next is the accuracy to the target hardware. Again, as noted, these are all run on real cell hardware, and although not just a stack of PS3s in a rack, they are at least the same architecture of the console, and as such should be identical. And we see that in the outputs, with the same operating system UI, the loading times, as all titles are installed to a HD or a hard drive, actually it'll be SANs most likely, these are faster than using the Blu-ray disc as I'm showing here. As such, loading is much faster than what you probably remember, but if you install to a hard drive or swapped with a faster SSD, it would likely be close to identical here. Menus, input, and all gameplay is a like-for-like replication of playing at home. Again, nothing to complain about here, as you get what it states on the tin. PS3 games on PS3 hardware running on your PS4 or PS5 without the need for a DualShock 3 or 6-axis. The next two are equally as important though, and fall into the accuracy level but are more important enough to be split out. Visual accuracy or improvements first, and here is what we start seeing limitations of the solution creeping in. In MotorStorm's case, the original PS3 title runs at a resolution of 1280 by 1080, which is a high output for the PS3 in general. This was a title that also employed the SPUs for its MLAA solution, a custom anti-aliasing solution from Sony's own UK internal R&D technology teams that was deployed across a great deal of first-party titles, such as God of War 3. And as such, this is a great example of what I referred to earlier about the complexities of the techniques and bespoke design to the host hardware, in this case the cell CPU. The result is a sharp game on a real PS3 with somewhat noisy and jagged outputs in the current post-process heavy TAA world we live in, but then this was top tier stuff back then. The PS5 stream is not as sharp or as high. The caveat here is I am UK based using an American server on an American system. It's not launched in the UK at the time of this video, but PS3 games are limited to 1280 by 720 streams, then upscaled to 1080 or 4K locally. The net result is we have a softer and less detailed image than our local PS3 version. Textures loosen with the sharpness seen on the right. High frequency pixels can be lost and sharpness in general is lower. Certainly not by drastic levels, but sufficient for this to look inferior to the game running locally, which you can see on the left. A limitation of the streaming solution, compression methods, server locality and more. As such, the image quality and resolution is degraded from the target platform, albeit very minor. In terms of sound output, comparing the two here, they're pretty much identical bar volume differences, but it all depends on the sound system you've got, but the streaming isn't severely affecting it as it doesn't need that much bandwidth. And we now come to the final and most vital aspect of games, the playing of them and performance. Taking the simplest factor first, frame rate, and the original PlayStation 3 game targeted 30 FPS here with an adaptive VSync. This allows it to tear when it drops below the required 33.3 milliseconds frame budget. This means that at points we get some mild bouts of tearing that largely stay near the top but can move the full height of the screen as it catches up. In my tested sections here, it's very close to that target, and if it does dip, the next 16 millisecond refresh is used to draw the rest of the image, resulting in small dips under that 30 FPS target, which is far from perfect, but really not that bad in play, as the fast-paced action and heavy traffic is what you concentrate on. The PS5 stream here is the exact same, with a 30 FPS target and adaptive VSync. However, it appears to be using that far more often, and the result is even when it should not be tearing, or at least it doesn't on the PS3 local hardware, it does on the stream, with a top fifth or so of the screen constantly tearing. Now this does happen on the base PS3 also, but it's only a couple of pixel lines high, so practically invisible. It's something which I noticed, but I'm sure a great many of you would not, but for performance review it is something to be noted. Nothing of great significance, and I'm not sure if it's a result of the stream, the encoding itself, the decode locally or what, but like the IQ to a lesser degree, performance is subtly below the local hardware experience, and even if that would be invisible without this kind of analysis, it is a reduction nonetheless. Which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, and that is the most important by far: input latency. So this is the time for when you click the button or move the joystick and something happens on screen. And as we've mentioned, this solution is streaming based, which means it is affected by a great many factors. The round trip time from your console ISP out to the remote data center, wherever that may be in the world, and back again in the video feed, the quality of service, time of day, yada yada. All of this is going to have a factor on the results. So these results should be taken as an advisor of the potential. We do see a reduction in the input times compared to local PS3 hardware. Quelle surprise. So in case of the local PS3 in MotorStorm, it has a low of 98.5 milliseconds. That's taken into account the TV, your variation might be a factor as well, and a high of 111. This is the variety of inputs, testing all those to get a median, which is 104.7 milliseconds. For the exact same sections on the PS5 stream, I saw a high of 186 and a low of 169 milliseconds, which means the median is 177.6 milliseconds, aka it's around 70% slower in terms of input times to play this title on the PS5 stream. As mentioned though, this will be faster or slower depending on your locale. I've tested this on a 60 FPS feed on PS Now in the UK before, and it's around 50% slower. But you need to caveat all that in. So you are seeing somewhere between 50 and 70% increase in input times using this streaming solution. And depending on the title, that will become more impactful. A title such as the retro classic in Final Fight is a good example of that, with that presenting significant input times streaming online, where we see a median input time of 150.6 milliseconds, which will translate to a sub 100 milliseconds for local play. And this means it feels far worse in Final Fight, which lives or dies by its instant response for a button basher arcade brawler like this, compared to something like MotorStorm, which was already quite heavy, and that input latency and lag was built into the controls, therefore making the car feel weighty. So some titles will not feel as bad as others, but fast-paced arcade actions, retro titles, they're possibly going to be the ones where you feel the input lag the most. In terms of the standout reductions over the original PS3 hardware, visual quality is one. Certainly in dark, high contrast scenes and fast-paced action such as The Force Unleashed 2 here stands out as one of the worst looking titles due to the reduction in bit depth, therefore the whole area looks very grey and washed out, that contrast doesn't work as well, and those fast-paced action particle effects create macro blocking in the video feed, which stands out the larger the screen, certainly on a large 4K one. The other section is in input latency, all dependent on the title itself, with some titles such as MotorStorm not really feeling sufficiently different to local for most people to just play and not feel the difference, and then other titles such as fast-paced arcade beat-em-ups, first-person shooters, Twitch-based gaming feels terrible to the point where if you're experiencing the title it can be borderline unplayable. But this has always been the case for streaming solutions. So bringing it back to my categorization at the start, let's put this into a quick, simple order. In terms of ease of use, this is better than the original hardware, much easier and simpler to use. In terms of accuracy, it's almost the same to the point where you wouldn't notice it. This is, for all intents and purposes, PS3 titles running in the cloud. In terms of the visuals, there is a small reduction, only minor, but certainly in the high contrast darker areas, the quality of the macro blocking in terms of the video feed, and on occasion some subtle changes to the tearing level, but fundamentally it's as close as you could possibly get, but no better. And in terms of performance, it's identical in terms of the frame rate. If it's a 30 FPS title with tearing, that's exactly what you'll get here. If it's 60, you'll get the same. The only reduction is those input latency times, which can be sufficiently bad on certain titles to stand out a mile, and on others not really be of huge factor. Next we come to the oldest and the newest, the classic PlayStation 1 and PSP titles. These are where Sony appear to have worked on a new and upgraded emulation solution over what we've seen before, certainly in the lackluster PlayStation Classic a couple of years ago. This now offers a selection of options expected, and we have seen in other emulation solutions: aspect ratio, upscale options, along with 3 types of output filters on the final screen buffer, all accessible from the options button. In addition, the titles here all have their resolution increased. meaning we go from 320 by 240 in titles such as Resident Evil Director's Cut or Tekken 2, and into a 4:3 ratio within a 16:9 or 16:10 output of 1920 by 1440, a 6 times increase across both axes, which is a substantial improvement and certainly helps the clarity and modernisation of these aging titles. But it doesn't fix one inherent problem of PlayStation 1 titles. And that was a vertex popping and affine texture mapping, which causes the standard and well-known warping textures and distortion. In fact, with these higher resolutions and clearer screens, it stands out even more, as you can see the warping and shifting of faces and characters. You can see a good example of it here with Resident Evil Director's Cut. And this is the combination. Due to the lack of floating point calculations, it used integers for its verts, and therefore they popped in and out. It then had affine texture mapping, which wasn't depth aware, which caused things to fight and twist and distort. And then finally, no Z buffer meant you got Z fighting, which is vertices fighting for who's in front or behind, and you can see this popping in and out of existence. Fundamentally, this is a limitation of emulating the original software, which is what it's doing, and it does improve it, so that's exactly what it's supposed to do, and therefore it's a pretty good result overall, because you get sharper, cleaner images which look like they're running on a PC emulator. And it is a welcome boost to visual quality, but title by title basis will vary. Fundamentally, this means that any 2D elements, such as games like Worms here or Abe's Escape, all of that will be as it was before, upscaled, because you cannot change those 2D elements. But anything that's a vector of vertices, that can be increased because it's intercepted in the emulation here and then increased by 6 times to improve the resolution output. In terms of their emulation solution, according to Patents Online, they are using a situation here to intercept and mimic the timing cycles of the original hardware, and on top of that they can also replace the textured assets with new ones. In fact, you can see the emulation here on something like Director's Cut. As it cuts from one camera shot to the next, you can see the actual objects themselves go back down to that pixelated PS1 original, and that stands out along with the texture details which reduce to the standard base, and then on the next shot they're back to where they were before. Overall, it's a good solution and it does improve the titles within the collection so far. In addition to this, the options in the menu to be able to change things such as those filter options are welcome. The actual CRT filter on that modern retro and the darkening of the image does help a lot on some of these 3D titles. Certainly Siphon filter benefits greatly from this. But the way this filter works is an intercepting of the original source output from the software, and that means it doesn't always work across all the titles in the collection thus far. Take Worms Armageddon for example, this just darkens the screen and nothing more. And again, this is intercepting that output, so then internal options in the title are affected. So the 4:3 16:9 ratio in the game doesn't work. You have to use the ones in this sub-menu, which is fine, but then they don't work all the time. 4:3 is fine for both, depending on your screen type, but 1:1, square pixels, native resolution, all of them squash and compress the image incorrectly, and certainly not native pixels. And don't even get me started on wind, zoom, stretched. I mean, who on earth does that with retro titles? Ugh. Anyway, the point is that it's nice that these features have been added, specifically the rewind feature, which shows that they're just taking a memory dump at set points and then you can rewind back to that and play the title. So if you've got a really frustrating older title in retro, then you can at least not have to die and reload the whole game. You just rewind back to the point before and see if you can finally kill that end of level baddie. And now we move to performance. So as confirmed already, the NTSC versions are 60 Hz across the board if you're in America or Japan. That means in the UK, as of the time of this video, just going live and finishing off, it has now launched, and this means that I can confirm that that is still 50 Hz in PAL. But PlayStation have now come out and said that they're going to add the option to choose between NTSC and PAL versions even here in the UK and across wider parts of Europe, which means you no longer have to have a 50 Hz output and a 60 Hz container. That's great, fixes one of my complaints would have raised here. We'll see how many titles get that, but the other issue here is you still don't get a boost over the original title. So it would have been nice, if possible, where games were 30 to boost them to 60, but that's not what we see here. Everything is as it was before. Higher resolution, better quality visuals, but fundamentally performance is the same. If it's the PAL version you're playing, it'll be 15. If it's the NTSC, it'll be 60, just like it was on the original base PS1. Again, it's a minor quibble, but it would have been nice to see improvements over something as old as PlayStation 1 titles now. The final piece of our categorization is input times, and surprisingly it's almost identical, even taken in the CRT. So 102.6 Resident Evil Director's Cut on the PS1 as a median input time in milliseconds versus 108.9. That's practically identical, and that's taken into account the TV. That's still very impressive and faster than a UK PS3 model here emulating PS1 titles, which comes in 142.2 milliseconds. And that means tank controls are completely unaffected. Impressive stuff. And that means the scores on the doors at the end, this emulation beats everything from the original. It's better in ease of use, it's better or identical in accuracy, and it presents better visual quality with no issues and artifacts. The only area of, quote, concern would be performance. Input times are practically identical and performance is identical, but it isn't any better than the base hardware, which for certain titles such as Siphon Filter, it can feel a little slow and sluggish now. But it even plays PSP titles and they are improved in resolution. Again, 2D elements, as you see here, don't improve, but the 3D elements do, and it's a welcome boost for older titles. So it is an area of growth, and I hope we see more titles hit the Classics collection very soon. Now comes the final piece, the PlayStation 2, and this, like the PlayStation 1, means you can download those titles and run them locally, and you see improvements over the original base PS2 hardware. Now, taking Naughty Dog's Jak and Daxter using the same categories as before, this was a very forward-looking title from the team. Now, the PlayStation 2 was another exotic and unique piece of hardware. The Emotion engine was a high point of marketing names for sure, but it did offer some very unique and powerful tools to developers, and Naughty Dog continued the trend of pushing hard on that score. It also gives us a great example of how PlayStation emulation has improved over the years, with the PlayStation 3 being one of the best consoles in terms of backwards compatibility. The original fat 60GB models enabled full PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 emulation, but only the launched Japanese and US models in 2006 delivered this with actual hardware contained therein. My launch UK model here emulates it via software, which covers a vast selection of PlayStation 2 titles and all PlayStation 1 games by inserting the original disc. So for ease of use, the PS3 is pipped by PS Premium, or at least it's identical, because it's probably easier to actually have an internet connection than it is to own the original disc. So it's borderline identical or better depending on your personal circumstance. Once booted up, for all intents and purposes, you're playing a PS2 game within a PS2 VM container on your PS3, PS4 or PS5. The PlayStation 3 solution can cause some bugs and crashing at times, so based on that, the PS Premium here offering is better than the older emulation and more stable and slightly faster. So for accuracy, it's better based on that, but for overall emulation to the PS2, it's practically identical. And this is the same solution that's likely in use across all PS2 classics within the portfolio thus far. So visuals next then, firing this up via the PS2 disc, that's software emulation. Then on the PS5 we can see the resolution has been doubled. The base PS2 and emulated PS3 version, in the NTSC settings at least, run at an approximate 576 by 224 resolution, as it could also have a 16:9 ratio. On PS4 and PS5, this is doubled to 1024 by 448, again approximately, which results in sharper geometry and improved texture clarity, making a welcome increase to the visual output over the PS2 and even PS3 versions. The same texture filtering, adaptive tessellation, LOD management and geometry from the base PS2 title is maintained, but we get significantly better image quality than PS2 and PS3, making this category better in all areas over original hardware and previous emulation. The visual accuracies also continue, with something as simple as the base verts being misapplied before the textures on camera cuts at certain points here for the Guru shading and then being applied. This is consistent across all emulated versions, as is the character warping between camera cuts, which is commonplace in titles nowadays. All of this is consistent. It does finally improve the 16-bit dithered output of the PS2, but the PS3 also does that.
Continue your search for artifacts, amigo. If the locals possess precursor items, you know what to do.
And performance is the final grade, and we see another win here for the premium service. Frame rates are significantly more stable and smoother over the PlayStation 3 emulation, which can lurch between 30 and 60 quite sharply at points, likely memory constrained with that 512 meg of RAM split between CPU and GPU. In addition, the older consoles output images in very different way to what modern consoles do, so update vertices and camera can intermittently jump around, meaning we can have some very minor pixel movement, also causing perceived dips in my frame rate tool, which may or may not be counted as dips, but the animation doesn't move and the camera doesn't move. It's just a jitter, effectively. The PS5 emulation can also dip in a few key points, likely related to the core engine sync at times, but this is just running that core PS2 code within a JIT process just in time, and predominantly this PS5 version here is 60 FPS, but it doesn't hold a locked 60 like the base PS2 does, as you can see for comparison shots here. But input times are improved significantly over the PS3 emulated version at least, and almost identical to what we see on the PS2, even with a CRT in tow. That is impressive levels of emulation.
Man, that stung! I told you we shouldn't have come here, and you listened! What?
And that wraps up our review of the PlayStation Premium Emulation Suite. The PlayStation 2 is the weakest of the lot, predominantly a 7-year-old solution released with 7-year-old titles that were available on the PS4 and Pro. I can see no difference between the PS4 and PS5 versions you can choose to download, other than the splash screen showing the DualSense or the DualShock, depending on your console. The emulator, again, which intersects the base code, can also have issues. As you see here with certain titles where progressive is an option, you can flick across and then it ends up breaking the output of the title itself, because the emulator is using that interlace feed to then increase the vectors or the vertices across all the objects here. And with it in progressive mode, that formula is getting broken and you end up with warped vertices, as you see here. So just be aware of that in certain games. The only benefit of PS2 titles is some of them, a great deal of them, had options which were brought in by the Dreamcast, which enabled you to choose 50 or 60 Hz, and this would be easy to reinitialize back into the main menu and allow you to choose that for PAL versions. And this means that if there is only a PAL version available and it has this option, you can get around any NTSC to PAL issues. Predominantly the PS2 will benefit the most from this. Many titles that are not available here did have performance hiccups, and there's a great selection of titles lost to time on the PS2. So I really hope that PlayStation start adding more titles in and third parties get on board. The simple fact is, these classic titles add a great deal of VAS to the service overall to get you to subscribe and stay subscribed. So for that, it makes sense. But I hope to see more titles hit the pack, and hopefully they fix some of the issues I've discussed here with the PlayStation 1 emulation and those output issues, and certainly would love to see some PS3 emulations at local level with improvements we've seen on the PS1 and PS2. But I'm sure there's enough here to create a tidal wave of nostalgia. Anyway, if you like these deep dives into tech, game related and subscription services, then keep it IGN, and we'll be back very soon with more performance reviews, and I'll catch you on the next one.